So we only have 3 lectures left in this course, and the last 2 lectures are going to be saved for the last 2 episodes of the show, because those 2 episodes are complex enough and rich enough that each of them really deserves its own lecture. Which means that this third to last lecture is the time when I finally need to make good on the problem that I've been setting up for the entire term. So for the whole, I shouldn't say the entire term, the entire season, the entire module, right? For this whole module, we've been talking about the relationship between past selves and present selves, when the past self is or isn't the same self as the present self, and when the present self can or cannot be held accountable for wrongs that the past self did. So now, using all of the theoretical mechanisms that we've built, right, we've brought on board all these different theories of the continuity of the self. We've looked at the performative and narrative pictures of the self. Bringing all of that together, what we want to ask is, does the show in the end hold Bojack accountable for the bad things he did in the past, particularly the death of Sarah Lynn, and does the show leave us with the idea that Bojack has become a genuinely new self or not? Using all of the theoretical machinery we've built, it seems like at this point we have 2 hypotheses. One hypothesis is that Bojack's new self is just an elaborate performance covering over his old self. All of these performances he's giving of being this guy who's sober, who's an academic, who works at the university, this is all really just an elaborate acting performance of a kind, which is a layer over who he truly is. And we do know that Bojack, for all that he keeps getting silly roles, really is a pretty good actor when he needs to be, right? So it's a convincing performance. According to this hypothesis, yes, this period of his life where he's sober and treating people well and teaching, it might be narratively fractured from and separate from the rest of his life, but lives might be narratively fractured, right? On this hypothesis, the narrative theory of identity is false, and a single self might contain multiple narratives that are fractured from one another. That still leaves it open what the criterion on this hypothesis is for him being the same self over time, right? We looked at various theories of that. But if this is true, if he's really the same self and he's just acting out this other character, then in this case, he is fully accountable for his past acts. The other hypothesis is that in some way or other, the self exists in its performances, right? That Judith Butler is right, and that the existentialists are right, and we are what we do, and that Bojack really does build a new self through his performance of this self and his iteration of these performances. And that, yeah, towards the end, he reverts to his old self when Angela inspires him to go on this drunken bender, but that's really a matter of him being one self, and then a new self, and then the old self again. That's a way of keeping the narrative and performative understandings of selfhood alive, right? And saying he really exists as a single self insofar as he has a single narrative, a single character, a single set of performances. Now, if that's true, if he really is a new self, is he accountable for his past actions or isn't he? Well, we could still answer that question either way now, right? We could say, well, he's a new person, so the person who did these terrible things was a different person, so it isn't fair for him to be punished now for what this old, no longer existing self did. Or we could say, even if he's not the same self, he has some special kind of tie of responsibility to his past self, or even his past multiple selves, even if they're not him. So think about it. If you have a child and that child does something, you're not the same as that child, but you might be accountable for that child's actions. Or if you are a boss and you have an employee and an employee does something, then even though you are not that employee, you may be accountable for what the employee did. So it might be that we are not our past selves, but we have such a tight relationship to our past selves, some kind of relationship of responsibility, such that we are still accountable for and can be held responsible for what our past selves did. So really that's 3 possibilities. Bojack is the same self and he's accountable. He's a different self and he's not accountable. And he's a different self, but he's accountable anyway in some more complex way. And I think all of those are live hypotheses. Now, I think that there's a complication that's going to help us see what the show gives us as an answer to this question, to the extent it gives us an answer. Because again, as I keep emphasizing, it doesn't solve philosophical problems for us. It only gives us ambiguous answers and tentative answers. But the show does something interesting that we haven't talked about yet that I think gives us a kind of a clue. And I want to go back to episode 9, or the first episode of 6B. Remember in that episode when Bojack is going to his AA meetings and he says, what was the first time? They ask everybody when the first time was that they drank. And he says, what was the first time I drank? What wasn't the first time I drank? And of course, this just sounds like a tossed off, awkward way of trying to be funny and avoid the question. But then we find out over the course of that episode that in an important existential sense, he really did drink for the first time over and over again, as paradoxical as that seems, right? We go backwards through time and we see many times in Bojack's life when some time that he drank shows up as the first time for him, right? When he's on the set of Horsing Around, when he's in college, and moving backwards all the way to that very first moving case where he drinks as a young kid after his parents have passed out to try to be included in his family. And he cuddles up with his mother, who is passed out drunk, because this is the only time he can. It's the only way in which he can feel close to them and feel like part of the family is to drink secretly along with them. And then the only way he can get affection is by cuddling up with her after she's already passed out. It's a very moving scene. It's the end of that episode. I don't know about you, but it definitely has made me cry each time I've watched it. But in any case, sorry for the dinging. It should stop any second. In any case, what does this mean that he drinks for the first time over and over again, and that each of these drinks shows up in his life as a first? In an important way, each of those is the start of a new narrative, right? Which way does this cut in terms of our two hypotheses? On the one hand, it shows us that his narrative is fragmented. It's not neat. It doesn't have a single beginning, middle, and end. It has lots of beginnings over and over again, and there are different versions of himself that start at different times, and each of these shows up as a start. But on the other hand, pushing against that fragmentation, all of these firsts come together into an iterative pattern, right? They may all show up as a first, but they're all the same kind of first. So if performative identity is a matter of repetition and iteration, then in a really important sense, he is repeating and iterating himself. And I'd like to suggest that this gives us one final new possibility, which is that selfhood exists in these recurring patterns, in these iterated performances that we perform over and over again, and not in either some sort of stable essence behind the performances, or in particular performances, or in particular narrative stages. Maybe all of those are wrong, and where we really reside, where our selfhood really is in the performative patterns that we engage in over and over again. So for example, another recurring pattern that Bojack gets involved in is he gets mixed up with 17-year-old girls, right? They're always 17, again and again, and each one seems to be a brand new coincidence, and yet it keeps happening. So we have Hollyhock, we have Penny, we have Jameson, we have Penny's friend Maddie, the one who he gets drunk and leaves at the hospital. In each of these cases, a 17-year-old girl shows up in his life, and he gets more enmeshed in her life than is appropriate. Even though the kind of enmeshment is different in each case, this is a pattern. It's a recurring performance that he engages in again and again. Another recurring pattern is that when he's stuck and scared, he calls Diane. And this always feels to him like a new choice that he's making, but it's a pattern that shows up over and over again. Okay, I'm going to pause there, and then we will engage in the second half of this lecture.